On December 5th, 2023, I had my second son via C-section, and so I wanted to share a little bit about that. Now, I was planning on having a repeat C-section. I had a C-section with my first son, and the process went really well. It was not a scheduled C-section with my first son. I had a somewhat long labor, and I was given the option of having a C-section and decided to go for it, and it was a great experience. So I had pretty high hopes for this second birth, and I went into it being like, okay, I'm okay with having a C-section. I also live in a smaller town, and it's like a smaller hospital, and so they really didn't recommend me, if I wanted to be at that hospital, to have a VBAC. So they did schedule my C-section for noon, which I was thrilled about. My first baby, I had my induction scheduled for 1 a.m. So I had no sleep. It was terrible. So this time I got like a full night's sleep, and then even to fast for the anesthesia, you're not supposed to eat. And all I had to do was not eat breakfast. So it was like amazing. So I got to the hospital 2 hours before my C-section was supposed to start, or I guess when I was scheduled for the C-section, and everything was like pretty calm. I was really nervous though, to be honest. I was kind of shaking just because I was like, oh my gosh, they're gonna give me surgery. Like, that's kind of nerve-wracking. And so we got to the hospital, and thankfully they had just updated the maternity ward, and so everything was brand new. Like, it was the first week that they were in there. So they hooked me up to the IV. They even got like an IV specialist to put the IV in me so they wouldn't mess up. Like, that's how amazing it was. Then they had all the people who were going to be there for the C-section introduce themselves to me, which was totally different than my first experience. So everyone was very calm, and it just was very routine. And I loved that because I don't want a crazy, experience. I don't want anything out of the ordinary. I really want it to be very routine. They did tell me, okay, your C-section might be a little bit delayed, but it was not, thankfully. And so right at 12, they had me walk to the OR. And again, totally different experience than my first, because with my first, I had an epidural that failed and I couldn't move my legs. And so they had to wheel me in, and I was so out of it. And this time I was like very aware of everything, which kind of made it worse in a way. But I got to the OR, and they sat me down on the table, and the anesthesiologist, who had already introduced himself to me, he started the spinal block. And this is already where it started to get not great. I started to feel a little bit of like uncomfortableness, pain in my left side. And I've had a C-section before, and I know that that is not what you're supposed to feel. And so I was like, I kept thinking like, okay, I'm not supposed to be feeling anything right now. I don't want to feel anything when I have my C-section. So I spoke up, and I was like, it kind of hurts a little bit on my left side. And he was like, you're not supposed to feel that. And so then he was like, I'm gonna put it in a little bit more, and he was checking it. And then he said something about, I think you have a little bit of like scoliosis. And he was like, did you do gymnastics or anything when you were younger? And I was like, not really. Fun fact, I guess I have like a little bit of an even spine, but thankfully this time he was able to finally get the spinal block like correctly. I was numb. That's all I know. I finally got numb, and I was like relieved. It's like, okay, I really don't want to feel anything. And so they laid me down on the table, and I get very nauseous with anesthesia. So immediately I felt sick. Thankfully I'd fasted. But my husband walks into the room, and I'm like so sick already. I'm like, oh my gosh. And he's like, oh, are you okay? So they put me down, and then I just kind of waited. And it felt different than my first, because with my first, I remember the process for my C-section going so fast. Like, I was so surprised at how fast it went with my firstborn. It was like they laid me down on the table and my son was born. This time there was a little bit more waiting, and I think it got me a little bit more anxious. And I also noticed they started, like, when they started cutting me open, so they were like basically on top of me trying to get this baby out. Like, that, I don't remember that happening with my firstborn, but it was like they were like climbing on top of me trying to push him out. So immediately I was thinking, like, this is different. Like, this did not happen with my first. And then finally he was born and he was not crying. That's the first thing I remember. There was no cry, and they rushed him over to the table, which is like right next to me, and they're like trying to get him to breathe and cry. And I remember just seeing him, and he was like, did not look like a lively baby. He was purple, and I mean, immediately I started praying. I was just like, oh my gosh, I need to start praying. And so I just started praying, and I don't even know what I was saying. I was just like praying, and my first thought was like, oh no, like we're gonna have to go get transferred to a different hospital, because I just knew something was wrong and nobody was really saying anything. My doctor did say right when he delivered him that he had the cord wrapped around his neck 2 times. So they brought my son to the table and they started pounding on his back, and finally he cried, and everybody in the room just breathed a sigh of relief, like, oh, because it was scary. Like, it was honestly so scary. I think that I also, looking back at it, I really detached the instant I saw my son, which is not what you're supposed to do when you have a baby. Like, you want to have that connection. You want to attach yourself to that baby. And I felt detached because I didn't want something really terrible to happen to him where I was going to be devastated. I'm so sad that that happened to me, because that's not how I wanted him to be born. And now I like love my son and I'm attached to him, and you know, he's amazing. But I think in that moment it was just like so scary that I just tried not to feel anything. After he started crying, they started cleaning him up, and they were still just trying to like pound on his back and get him to breathe better, and they did not put him on me skin to skin. With my firstborn, they put him on my chest, and it was like this lovely moment. And with my secondborn, they were just trying to get him to breathe. And so I was just laying there like, is anybody gonna put him on my chest? Like, I want to see my son. And I kept asking, like, what's going on? Like, what's going on? And they weren't really saying anything, but I could tell that like something was still not right. So then they told us that we're gonna go ahead and like take your son to the next room, and we're gonna give him a little oxygen. He just needs a little bit of help. My blood pressure started going up, which obviously, but I mean, that's really a dangerous situation in that kind of scenario. And so my blood pressure spiked. And so they were kind of mentioning that, like, her blood pressure's going up, and they took my son away with my husband to another room, and they were giving him oxygen. And I was just there, like, thinking, I hate this. I had felt amazing going into the room, and all of a sudden everything just like was going wrong. They finally stitched me up and did all the things that they needed to do. They wheeled me to my room, and I was just there, and I was completely out of it. And they said that they were scared for me because of my blood pressure spiking. They needed to give me some medicine. I had postpartum preeclampsia, and so they had to give me, like, basically drug me up. I couldn't really move. I was like out of it. And I remember sitting there in the like postpartum delivery room and thinking, like, I can't believe how amazing I felt 2 hours ago, and now I feel horrible. So I waited there for like probably about 30 minutes just by myself with the nurses, and then finally they brought my son into the room, and the nurse said the doctor wants to do skin to skin with the mom. And so they put my son on my chest, and like immediately he just started relaxing, and I just started relaxing, and we got to like cuddle, and he started breathing correctly. And I didn't know this, but they were actually really concerned before this part. They were giving him oxygen in another room, but he still was not responding super well to it. And so finally the pediatrician was like, let's just give him to mom and see what happens. That's all he needed, was to be just like put on my chest and have that skin to skin, and it like automatically just perked him up. Wow. I mean, like, honestly, that makes me want to cry because he just needed his mom and I just needed my son. Like, that's all it was. After this scenario, I was completely drugged up and I couldn't like really move out for the next 24 hours. I couldn't get out of bed. I was like out of it. The only thing I could do was try to breastfeed. And I think that the medicine that they had given me was making my son really sleepy. So breastfeeding did not go very well. My son like immediately would fall asleep, and it was like he was drugged because I was drugged. You know, I mean, obviously newborns are also really, really sleepy. I think like the first night I was just crying because I just missed my son, my firstborn son, so much. Like, I was just crying, and I was just, all I wanted to do was go home. That's it. I just wanted to go home. And I was like, I can see why people have home births, because this sucks right now. 24 hours later, they took me off of all that medicine. I started to feel a lot better. And honestly, I was like kind of perked up right away. I was already walking around. I was just trying to do everything to let me go home. Like, I did not want to stay in the hospital at all. So they let me go, and we finally got to go home with our newborn, who honestly was doing perfect. Like, after they put him back on my chest, he was totally fine. Like, everything was fine with him. But that's my birth story, and did not go as well as I wanted it to. Was not like the wonderful birth that I wanted. I thought, you know, my first birth did not go great. Definitely did not go as planned. The second one I feel like was worse. So maybe, you know, I still want one more child. Maybe the third will be like the birth that I've longed for, where we're just stress-free. I hope this doesn't scare anyone from having a child. We're just happy to all be safe and home and healthy, and everyone is doing well. We've all like literally just bounced back from that experience. So that's all for this. See you guys in the next video. Bye.